When I was growing up in Dallas, camping was never something I did willingly. Why would anyone want to go out to the wilderness and deal with bugs? The whole idea seemed ridiculous. It wasn't until I left for college that I realized how fun it could actually be. During my 4 years at North Texas, I went from being a die-hard city kid to someone who could have survived in the wild. But then, something happened that ruined my love for the outdoors to this day. As I mentioned, I never really got along with nature before moving to Denton. If there was a spider web, I would always find it. If mosquitoes were around, I was their prime target. You get the idea. By chance, I ended up rooming with a guy from near Lufkin. He had grown up surrounded by woods, and some of his friends from home were also at North Texas with us. They often went camping around the state during breaks, so when spring break came up, they invited me to join them at Lake Texoma. If you haven't heard of it, Texoma is a well-known lake near Denison, famous for its fishing and scenic beauty. I wasn't thrilled about staying in Dallas, and I didn't really know any of the cool kids who were heading to the coast, so Texoma it was. With no camping experience, I relied entirely on my friends for advice. I borrowed gear, made do with what I had, and the only thing I didn't skimp on was bug spray. Deep woods off became my best friend. That trip turned out to be an eye-opener. Since I had covered myself in bug spray, I was finally able to focus on the experience itself. Everything was going smoothly, and then I caught my first fish. I was hooked. The rest of the trip was spent learning everything I could about the outdoors. After that, I made sure I joined every camping trip for the next 2 years. That summer, I even made it to the coast. When I wasn't in class or resting, I walked everywhere, from one end of town to the other. Despite being a university town, Denton still had that small-town charm. I knew the woods and tracks by heart, and in the warmer months, I spent hours honing my skills at the nearby Lake Lewisville. I don't think my friends from East Texas knew as much about the woods as I did. Over time, my friends back in Dallas told me I had changed. I didn't mind, though. I was determined never to leave nature behind, and in a way, I've always stayed connected to it. But as much as I love the outdoors, I don't think I'll ever be able to return to the woods the way I once did. It was spring break during my final year when I decided to go on one last camping trip. By this point, some of my camping buddies had either dropped out of school or transferred. Only a couple of guys remained, but we didn't really keep in touch. I had been planning a big trip to a popular national park in the eastern part of the state. I won't name it here, as I don't want to discourage anyone from visiting, but it's known for its natural beauty, despite some darker rumors surrounding it. Before leaving, I had been warned to watch out for overzealous hunters, but I knew this trip wouldn't coincide with hunting season, so I felt safe. After checking my list one last time, I loaded my Jeep and made the 3-hour drive to my campsite. I arrived just after 3 p.m., set up camp, and decided to explore a bit before dinner. It was then that I noticed something strange. Well, I didn't actually see anyone, but the feeling that I was being watched lingered. I cut my hike short and returned to camp. Though bears weren't known to live in this area, I had read some stories online, and the idea of being eaten on my first day wasn't exactly appealing. After a quick dinner, I hit the sack just after dark. Nothing unusual happened that night as far as I could tell. The next morning, the air was crisp and fresh, probably the cleanest I had ever breathed. Breakfast was quick and simple, though I don't recall exactly what it was. The beauty of the morning made me eager to explore, so I packed a small day bag with some emergency supplies and snacks and set off on the trail. The next few hours were peaceful, with only the occasional snap of twigs or rustling leaves breaking the silence. Around 11 a.m., I stopped for a snack. While I waited for my stove to heat some water, I leaned against a pine tree and must have dozed off. That was when a mosquito decided to make a meal of my neck. I woke with a start, swatted the pest, and then noticed a flash in the distance. I briefly questioned whether I had imagined it, but the loud call of a crow confirmed that I wasn't alone. Though I wasn't scared yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. Eventually, the crow moved on, and I was able to finish my coffee in peace. I figured if whoever was out there hadn't shown themselves by now, they probably meant me no harm. I spent a little more time at that spot before packing up and continuing my hike. After about another half hour, it became clear that I wasn't alone. Whoever had been trailing me hadn't learned to be quiet in the woods. The rustling of leaves was faint but constant, and a strange smell started drifting toward me. I stopped and sniffed the air, and suddenly, everything went quiet. My curiosity got the best of me, and despite my instincts, I walked toward the smell. I had only taken a few steps when a puff of dirt shot up near me. A split second later, I heard a loud crack. I turned, and before I could react, another crack came from behind. It dawned on me that I was being shot at, and I hit the ground instantly. I didn't dare move, holding my breath, trying to hear any movement. The warnings about overzealous hunters rang in my head. I yelled, hoping the shooter would realize their mistake, but there was no response. I stayed still, listening. Eventually, the sounds of the forest returned, confirming I was no longer being targeted. Still shaken but unhurt, I got to my feet, brushed myself off, and the strange smell hit me again. For some reason, I didn't learn my lesson and started walking toward it once more. This time, a quick series of shots rang out in my direction. I didn't think, just turned and ran as fast as I could. My only goal was to make it back to safety. I prayed over and over for a safe escape, but a couple of shots rang out behind me. I didn't stop to check where they hit, too focused on getting away. I ran for what felt like forever, only stopping when my body gave out. No shots had come for a while, but I wasn't about to stay in the same place. After chugging down some water, I continued my escape at a much slower pace. Within the hour, I was back at camp. I was desperate to leave and get back to Denton as quickly as possible. I packed up without wasting time, even leaving the fire half done. Something I would never have done under normal circumstances. I didn't want to contact the police, fearing I'd be forced to return to the scene of what had happened. The thought made me feel sick. The further I got away from the national park, the guilt started eating at me. I couldn't help but think that someone else might stumble onto what I had left behind. I didn't think I could live with the guilt of a preventable death. Around 20 miles out, I finally found a police station. I reported the incident, but the officer wasn't too surprised. He mentioned the overzealous hunter theory, but I didn't buy it. Had the shooting stopped when I shouted out, that might have made sense. The truth was, I had no idea what had happened, and neither did the officer. He promised to check it out, but I wasn't hopeful. I didn't think they'd find anything, let alone contact me.
He didn't got it.
There was no way I was ever going back to that place. When I got home, I probably looked like a fool kissing the ground outside my house, but the relief was overwhelming. Things went back to normal over time, but despite the terrifying event, I intended to go back to the woods, just not those woods. I was browsing through 4chan one day when a post caught my attention. The original poster had been hiking in an area he thought he knew well. Rumors had been circulating for years about huge marijuana farms being guarded by cartel members, but he never took them seriously. That is, until he accidentally stumbled upon one of these grow sites. No one had been around, so he tried to leave quietly. As soon as he turned to leave, gunfire erupted around him. He was grazed on the cheek but managed to escape. The experience terrified him, and he was too scared to report it. The whole thing seemed too convenient to me, but the idea stuck with me. I hadn't considered the possibility of something like that happening before, but after my experience, it felt more real. Years have passed, and life is much like it was before I went to college. The only difference is that I'm older and much more aware of the natural world. Sometimes, I find myself gazing into the woods near my home, feeling that same pull I once did, but it's not the same. I know that the odds of something like what I experienced happening again are slim, but it's not fear that keeps me away, not anymore. Now, when I look at the woods, I can't see them in the same way. What I encountered has changed how I view the wild, and it'll never be as beautiful to me as it once was. But I keep my memories, and I share what I know with anyone who's interested. I prefer to remember the woods as they were, pure, pristine, and beautiful. In the early summer of 2018, I set off on a long-awaited camping adventure out west. The trip had been in the works for nearly 2 years, and it would be my first time camping with firearms. The drive to the destination was enjoyable, and I discovered a lot about that region of the country I hadn't known before. Once I arrived, I parked my truck and let my contact know I had safely reached the area. We reviewed my plan one final time, and I began the long hike to my campsite. The first day was peaceful. The weather was perfect, so I slept outside by the fire. It was a refreshing feeling of freedom compared to the restrictions back home. The next day was much like the first. I walked slowly, taking in the wildlife around me. Around 1:30 p.m., I reached the spot I had planned to camp. A quick check confirmed it was a good choice, and soon I had everything set up and was cooking lunch. Afterward, feeling a bit sleepy, I decided to do some shooting since that was the reason I had come. About 200 yards from camp, I found a dry creek bed, which seemed like the safest place to shoot. I set up a few steel targets and began firing. The excitement I felt was hard to explain. This must have been what the pioneers experienced, I thought. I had gone through a box of ammo and was reloading my SKS when I heard gunshots echoing through the hills. Curious, I went to investigate. The shots kept coming, and they seemed to come from several different firearms, which made me uneasy. I decided to head back to camp, sensing that the shooters might not be too welcoming. In hindsight, it was a decision I still question but also thank myself for making. When I returned, I thought about what to have for dinner. The shooting stopped soon after I got back, so I assumed they had moved on and that the evening would be quiet. After cleaning my guns for about an hour, I sat back by the fire and dozed off. Instead of cooking a full meal, I snacked on crackers and bacon-flavored cheese. As the sun began to set, I decided to turn in early. It was completely dark when a noise woke me. I jumped up and looked outside my tent but saw nothing. Assuming it was just a dream, I lay back down. But then, I heard it again. A chilling scream, unlike anything I'd ever heard. It was the worst sound, more terrifying than the cries of a rabbit being killed by a predator. The screams continued, followed by a woman's voice calling for help. My heart raced. What should I do? I briefly considered grabbing my rifle and rushing into the darkness, but by now it was clear where the screams were coming from, the same direction the gunshots had been earlier. I chose to stay put, and just then, another scream rang out, followed by a single gunshot. I was frozen with fear, unsure of what to do until daylight. The feeling of freedom I had earlier was gone. I anxiously awaited the sunrise, convinced that danger was coming with the dawn. When the sun finally rose, I packed up my gear in record time and began heading back to what I considered a safer place, or really anywhere but there. A journey that had taken me a day and a half just days before took me less than one to return. Every few minutes, I glanced over my shoulder, my rifle gripped tightly, expecting someone to be chasing me. I reached my truck just after dark and drove home, relieved to be leaving. But as the relief began to fade, guilt settled in. I thought I had heard a woman in desperate need of help being murdered, and yet I did nothing. I didn't report it, didn't try to help. For the entire drive home, my mind battled between my ego and reason. One moment, I hated myself, calling myself a coward. The next, I told myself it would have been foolish to chase after unknown attackers in the dark. The truth is, I was afraid like a child seeing their first scary movie. But at the same time, running off into the night after several unknown assailants would have been reckless. Yet the guilt still stings to this day. I didn't act heroically or cowardly, but in the end, I wondered if I should have reported what happened. What I had witnessed was a stretch. Really, I only heard a few screams and gunshots in the middle of nowhere without solid evidence. Reporting it would likely have just made me a nuisance to the authorities. Months later, I finally found the courage to learn what had really happened. I was camping just a mile away from a notorious outlaw biker gang. That day, they had arrived at their usual spot, where they would use illegal firearms. Unfortunately, they had also kidnapped a woman hiker, subjecting her to hours of abuse. After they released her, she managed to escape and flee from their camp. Those screams for help were her desperate cries, but she was shot and left to die. In a miracle, the woman survived. She somehow found her way to the highway and managed to get help. After a week in the hospital, she was released. The bikers, knowing they were caught, accepted plea deals, and most of them will spend the rest of their lives in prison. Though I was relieved to hear the victim survived, I couldn't stop thinking about the what ifs. What if I had done something? What if I had reported it sooner? I never told anyone about this, and writing it here is probably the closest I'll ever come to sharing it. If you think I'm a coward for not intervening, I don't blame you. This story wasn't meant for people like you. It's for those who understand the temptation to avoid conflict. I get it now, the fear of being punished for doing the right thing. Many people who try to help others end up paying the price for it. But I can tell you from experience that the guilt of an action is far worse than the risk of stepping in. We're all in this together. If we can, we should help those in need. Imagine being in someone else's shoes. You could be the only one standing between them and survival. Growing up, stability was a luxury I didn't know. After splitting up with my dad, my mom dated a string of guys, even letting some move in. When I was around 15, she married a guy named Mike, whom she met at the bar where she worked. Mike was a real jerk and tried to take my dad's place in my life. Mom had tried to keep my dad away from me, but I always knew he cared and wanted to be part of my life. Before the divorce, Dad and I would go fishing, camping, and spend time outdoors. I developed a love for nature I could never shake and didn't want to. This made it easy to decide to live in the woods. By 18, I was done putting up with Mike's controlling ways. Although he rarely had a job, he expected me to be up by 7 a.m., even though I worked 5 days a week. Since my junior year, I'd saved money to move out. Being away from him and Mom was my goal. I left school, got my GED, and started planning. On days off, I thought I deserved to sleep in, but Mike had other ideas. The stress from work was bad enough, and when Mike barged in, yelling for me to wake up, I told him to back off. He moved like he was going to hit me, so I reacted and knocked him down. That was the last straw. I knew he'd call the cops, so I grabbed my backpack and left, never intending to go back. I wandered around town, no plan or vehicle, as the sun set. Eventually, I found some woods on the outskirts, walked far enough in to be hidden from the road, made a fire, and set up a bed with leaves and clothes. That night was unexpectedly cozy, but I didn't see it as a long-term plan. I thought I'd find an empty place to stay temporarily, but that turned out to be tougher than expected. All the decent places were either secured or used by gangs. Spending the night on the ground wasn't ideal, so midweek, I stopped by a store, got a sleeping bag, and built a makeshift shelter with foil-lined tarp to reflect heat from the fire, making the nights much warmer. To keep clean, I used public bathrooms and laundromats, sometimes staying overnight at the 24-hour ones. My coworkers noticed but didn't say anything. Eventually, I found a nearby river to wash in. Life out there wasn't as bad as it could have been, though it wasn't ideal. My camp was next to railroad tracks, which often had drifters passing through. A makeshift hobo camp was about half a mile away, across the tracks. I discovered it one evening by following the tracks, which were safer than the busier roads. Once, as I headed back to camp, I saw firelight through the trees. I peeked down a hill and saw 3 older guys around a fire. They saw me and invited me to join them. I mostly listened to their stories until they asked my name and where I was going. I made up a name, said I lived nearby, and we talked about a life riding the rails. At some point, they let me try a cheap bottle of wine. Not something I'd recommend, but I came to like it. The colder season rolled in, bringing chilly nights and some unruly drifters. I was almost one of them by then, sharing many evenings with regulars by the fire, listening to stories and passing around bottles. One of the more unpredictable drifters was an older guy named Pete. He stayed quiet at first but got aggressive when he drank too much. One night, he picked a fight with me. He knocked me down and started kicking me until the others pulled him off. After that, I kept my distance from unfamiliar faces. I followed this rule until I got too trusting and ran into trouble. It was this second incident that eventually pushed me to finally get my own place. As fall approached, I was promoted at work. The extra money helped, as I was mostly spending my paychecks just trying to survive. One day, I saw another guy about my age walking toward me with a backpack. He seemed all right and introduced himself as Ben. He said he'd come from Oklahoma City, and we talked for a bit before going our separate ways. Later, we continued our conversation by the fire, sharing stories. The second night, I let slip that it was payday. I was usually cautious about my earnings. I never let people see me with much cash and hid my savings in various spots, which I moved around regularly. That night, Ben asked if he could borrow some money. I told him I'd spent what I had on the bottle we were sharing, but he didn't believe me. He pulled out a long pocket knife and I realized he was serious. Terrified, I held onto the lie as long as I could, but fear overtook me. Just as I was about to turn and run, Ben took a swipe, slashing my arm. I started backing away up the hill, watching him, when another figure stepped out of the shadows behind him. It was another guy from the group, Sam, holding a sturdy stick. He'd overheard Ben calling me Mr. Moneybags earlier and suspected something was up. Ben started stirring, cursing Sam, who warned him to leave or get a worse beating. Ben took off and I didn't see him again. For safety, I spent the next few nights at the hobo camp and took a different route to work for a while. 2 attacks in under a year were enough. I'd saved enough to get a place. That weekend, I searched online and by Sunday evening, I was sleeping in my very own, if tiny, apartment. A few months later, I found a better place and stayed there for 3 years. Sometimes I think back to Sam and the other guys. They were kinder than most people would imagine, but even surrounded by good people, living rough isn't something I'd recommend to anyone. This happened to my wife and me last year, right after the restrictions were lifted in our area. As soon as it was safe, we packed up our gear and decided to hike at our local nature reserve. Hiking was something we used to do a lot before we got married, and I was really looking forward to it. Our plan was to trek out to a particular lake, camp overnight, and then head back the next day. The weather was clear and warm, and the trails were dry. For most of the morning, we were the only ones on the path. Around halfway to the lake, we stopped for lunch at a campsite. We noticed another couple had the same idea. They were sitting at a stone picnic table, and we asked if we could join them. The conversation started naturally, and soon the 4 of us were chatting about the trail and our plans. It turned out that they were newlyweds on their honeymoon. My wife, being a hopeless romantic, loved hearing this, and she shared how we met and some other sentimental details that I can't quite remember. After about 2 hours, We said our goodbyes and continued on our way. We reached the lake just before nightfall, tired and hungry. I built a fire and my wife, Laura, prepared a simple meal while I set up the tent. We sat by the fire, roasted marshmallows, and talked for a while before heading to bed around 10 p.m. The next morning, I woke up before dawn, stoked the fire, and started breakfast. Laura and I repeated our roles from the night before, except this time I took down the tent and packed everything up. I made sure the fire was completely out, and we hit the trail to head back home. At 10 a.m., we made it back to the midpoint but didn't stop. 2 hours further up the trail, we came across the husband from the couple we'd met. Strangely, his wife wasn't with him. Laura asked where she was, and the man said she'd become sick the night before and had to go back home. When he said this, he seemed uneasy and wouldn't meet our eyes. Before we could ask more, he quickly added that his wife had insisted he finish the hike alone. It was a bit odd, but we didn't have a reason to doubt him. Just then, a group of hikers came by, and he excused himself to join them. I didn't feel the need to ask more. It wasn't our business. Laura seemed like she wanted to stay longer, but I reminded her that we had things to take care of at home. She reluctantly agreed, and we continued on our way. We arrived at the parking lot soon after and packed our gear. There were a few groups of people talking, and we saw several cars, including a ranger's truck, pull in. I didn't think anything of it at the time. We got home later that afternoon and took care of some family matters. It wasn't until the next morning at breakfast that we heard the news. I grabbed a cup of coffee and turned on the TV just in time to catch a news report about a woman who had died while camping. When they showed her picture on the screen, I almost spilled my coffee. It was the woman we had met just 2 days earlier. I called Laura into the living room to make sure I wasn't imagining things. I wasn't wearing my glasses, and I pointed at the TV. "Isn't that the newlywed we met at the park?" I asked. Laura stared at the screen and gasped. Right then, a wedding photo of the couple appeared. Laura grabbed the remote and turned up the volume. According to the husband, the couple had been at a popular lookout, a cliffside with a great view. Laura and I had been there a couple of times before. They had watched the sunrise, and when they were about to leave, the wife lost her footing and fell to the ground below. It was believable, but something didn't sit right with me. Why hadn't he told us this when we met? Why the illness story? The way he had acted just didn't make sense. If something like that had happened to me, I would have been a mess. We had passed at least 15 other people on the trail that morning, and no one had spoken to us about the incident. It all seemed strange. I was glad Laura shared my suspicion. She had a gut feeling that something wasn't right, and I couldn't shake the feeling either. We talked for a while about what we should do and decided it might be worth contacting the authorities. I called the sheriff's office and told them what we knew. They put me on hold, and when they returned, they said someone might contact us later, but no one ever did. It's been almost a year, and no one has reached out to us. This is why I'm emailing you now. What do you think? My instincts and Laura's are telling us that something may have gone wrong, but we have no evidence to back it up. If the police thought we had useful information, they'd have called us by now, right? I don't want to cause trouble for a grieving man who appears to be a decent person, but I can't ignore this feeling. Should we keep pushing for answers or just leave it to the police to handle? I just have this nagging suspicion that something much worse happened, and the man is getting away with it. Although this story is far from finished, most of what I'm going to tell you happened around 12 years ago. It was about 2012, and I was still living with my parents. We had moved into the neighborhood when I was 14. Not long after, I found the woods across the street. I ended up making the woods my escape because of the bullying I went through and the stress at home. This neighborhood didn't have many kids, and the few that lived here were much older than me. All the tension made me a nervous wreck. Any free time I had, I spent by myself. One day, I decided to explore the woods. There didn't seem to be anyone else out there, and that gave me a sense of peace, something I hadn't felt in a while. I came across a small cluster of cedar trees that created a secluded clearing, and I started calling it my hideaway. As time passed, I spent more and more time there. I even ended up falling asleep in the trees one night. I thought for sure my parents would flip, but they never even noticed. From that point on, I started camping in my little spot on weekends. First, no one seemed to miss me. I quickly realized I needed proper camping gear, so I began going door to door, offering to mow lawns. I had never mowed a lawn before, but that didn't matter. The biggest challenge was finding a lawnmower. I'd sneak my dad's mower out, do the job, and eventually got caught and punished. Thankfully, I saved up enough to buy a cheap lawnmower of my own. With my new lawnmower in tow, I started working for real money. Once I had enough saved up, I rode my barely functioning bike about 5 miles to an army surplus store. I bought an Alice pack full of camping gear I thought would be useful. I was so excited that I skipped a week of school to test out my new equipment and camped out in my spot. It became an obsession, but more than that, it was the only place where I felt safe and happy for years to come. I went to school just enough to stay under the radar, but most afternoons I would head straight to my hideaway. By then, I considered the woods my territory. Anyone else out there felt like an intruder. So when I encountered 2 men one Sunday afternoon, I didn't hesitate to defend my space. I'd been camping all weekend and was walking to the creek to gather water. About 50 yards away, I noticed a camper parked on a deserted road. 2 men were moving in and out of it, but they didn't notice me. When I returned a few hours later, they were still there, now drinking beer and shooting guns. I was angry, but it wasn't until a stray bullet landed just inches from me that I couldn't take it anymore. I ran home, called the sheriff, and made up a story about being lost and threatened by the men with their guns. I didn't think anyone would trace the call back to me, but the following day I heard a news report about a drug bust, and my call was mentioned. The sheriff had tracked down the men after receiving an anonymous tip. They were arrested for manufacturing drugs in the camper. I realized the seriousness of the situation and was terrified, but I believed no one would figure out that I was the one who made the call. A few months later, I got an anonymous letter in the mail. It just said, "You messed with the wrong people, kid." The fear hit me like a ton of bricks, but I still didn't think it was from the men. A week later, I got another letter, more threatening. "You better pray we get time served." I couldn't understand how they knew it was me, but by that point, I was just scared and didn't want to think about it. The letters kept coming. Then, during their trial, the judge sentenced both men to 20 years after finding them guilty of drug manufacturing and possession of firearms. I thought for sure my time was running out. I stopped going to school and spent all my time hiding in the woods. I knew it wouldn't protect me, but if I was going to die, I wanted it to happen in a place I loved. Strangely, the death I feared never came. Month after month, I began to feel like it had all been a bluff, or perhaps just a way to intimidate me. Life went on, and the last 10 years were filled with ups and downs, with the 2 men from the woods becoming a distant memory. Then, last week, I got another anonymous letter. It read, "You better write a will. The end is near." I dropped it in shock, and my girlfriend saw it. She read it too and seemed worried, but I brushed it off as a prank. I didn't explain anything to her. Now, the fear from my past has returned. I feel like I'm always looking over my shoulder. I'm terrified that these men might go after my girlfriend or our baby. I briefly considered going to the police, but without proof of who sent the letters, I know they can't do much. My options feel limited. With no one else to talk to, I'm anonymously sharing this story, hoping someone will hear it. Please be careful with the choices you make when you're young. Wish me luck and keep my family in your prayers. In the summer of 2006, I was hiking the paths of a nearby national forest, as I'd been doing for several years. The hour-long drive to the forest went smoothly, as usual. I parked by the ranger's office and let him know my plans. After a final check of my backpack, I set off on my 2-mile trek to my usual campsite. I had no idea that someone's life had just taken a tragic turn, and that I'd soon be pulled into it. My love for the outdoors began after the events of September 11th. Though I wasn't directly near any of the attack sites, I lost someone very close to me. She and I had been college sweethearts but drifted apart. Thanks to the internet, we reconnected, and we were planning to meet for Thanksgiving to explore renewing our relationship. The news of her passing shattered me, and I started planning my own end. I got as far as packing a bag and heading to a remote spot, but something shifted when I arrived. The beauty of the landscape took hold of me, balancing the pain I felt with a calming peace. That moment changed my mind. My grief stayed with me for some time, but whenever it felt overwhelming, I'd return to nature, finding a way to cope. So here we were in the summer of 2006. My retreats had become a regular habit. Nothing unusual happened that first evening. The next day, I thought over my plans and decided to hike down into the canyons. I often found some small arrowheads or stones for my growing collection. After a quick oatmeal breakfast, I set out down the trail. About halfway down a cliffside, I noticed a glint of light, though I couldn't find the source right away. Another flash temporarily blinded me. When my vision cleared, I saw 2 arms waving around about 40 feet down the cliff. I hurried down the trail for a better view. There was a small rock ledge on the side, so I jumped onto it, but it began to crumble beneath me. The fall felt endless, and I braced myself for a painful landing, but thankfully, it wasn't as bad as I'd feared. Lying on my back, I looked up and saw I'd only fallen about 15 feet. I stayed there a moment, then remembered why I'd come down. Trying to stand, I noticed my left foot was stuck between 2 large rocks. I pushed the top one and wiggled my leg free. Once on my feet, I looked around and saw a woman lying nearly motionless off to my right. Carefully, I made my way down the slope until I reached her. She looked lifeless at first, but then I saw her lips moving. Kneeling beside her, I began speaking in a calm voice. I asked her name. Her eyes opened slowly, and a faint smile crossed her face. "I thought I'd lost you when I saw that rock give way," she said in a hoarse but gentle voice. "Sorry to bother you, sir, but do you have any water?" I quickly rummaged through my bag and pulled out my bottle. It was a bit dented but still intact. I slowly held the opening to her lips, letting her drink a small amount. I knew too much too quickly could make her sick. Over the next few minutes, she explained how she'd ended up there. Occasionally, I gave her a little more water. She was clearly in severe pain, and I knew I couldn't delay if she was to get help. I told her my plan, covered her with the fleece from my pack, and started the climb back up the rocky hillside. Climbing up was much harder, and by then, I was in considerable pain, especially in my back. I tried to jog but had to settle for a brisk walk. The journey was long and difficult, but I made it to the ranger's post a little after 1 p.m. The ranger quickly assembled a rescue team, and I had to settle for an ambulance ride and an overnight hospital stay. It was close to 6:30 p.m. when I saw the emergency staff bringing her in. Sadly, she had to be rushed into surgery soon after, so there was a long wait for any news. But when it finally came, it was positive. Despite having a punctured lung, a concussion, a broken arm, and other injuries, she would fully recover. My own journey toward healing is a story for another time, but her name was Karen, was reunited with her family and went on to start her own. Last I heard, she was living in Utah with her husband and 3 kids. I hope everyone joins me in wishing her a long and joyful life. I'm just grateful I was there when she needed someone most. When I was younger, I always dreamed of becoming a scout. Back then, it was still a well-regarded group that taught practical outdoor skills. I think I was around 9 when I finally convinced my mom to let me join. She was hesitant at first. Back in her home country, groups like Scouts were often just a cover for military-style training for kids. I asked our den leader to talk to her, and after a long list of questions, she finally relaxed. With that hurdle cleared, I became a Cub Scout. Sadly, scouting in my area wasn't quite what I'd hoped for. Our leader was a high-strung single mom who lacked enthusiasm, which was a big disappointment to me. About 6 months in, though, there was a glimmer of excitement. A scout leader from another town invited us to join his group for a weekend camping trip. This was one of the main reasons I'd wanted to join Scouts in the first place. I loved going camping with my family, but those trips had ended after my parents split up. The leader picked us up early on a Saturday morning and drove us all to the campsite. There were only about 8 or 9 kids there in total. He gathered us around and gave instructions on how to set up the tents. Each tent would sleep 2 boys, but because of the odd number, I got a tent to myself. One by one, he showed us our spots and we started setting up. A few needed help, but everything went pretty smoothly overall. The rest of the morning was filled with first aid lessons and general safety. I was paired with the leader and ended up being the demo subject, wrapped in bandages and carried on a makeshift stretcher. It was fun and, as it turned out, would come in handy later. After first aid training, we had lunch and took a short rest until about 3 p.m., when we were all called back for archery lessons. I was beyond excited. Ever since seeing my first action movie, I dreamed of shooting a bow. This was my first real chance. The leader gave us a brief tutorial stressing safety. But, of course, we were a bunch of energetic preteen boys, so not everyone was paying full attention. I was the first to try. I pulled back the string, crouching down like a ninja, which got me scolded. I had to stand upright, which was a bit of a letdown, but it was thrilling to see the arrow land where I'd aimed. After my turn, everyone else got their shot, and then we were allowed to practice on our own. The boys all chatted, challenging each other to see who could shoot better. Then, the unexpected happened. A boy named Kevin was talking to another boy, Chris, while holding an arrow with the string pulled back about a quarter of the way. Chris said something that made Kevin turn toward him. Kevin must have slipped or accidentally let go because the arrow flew forward, hitting Chris in the chest and going in about 8 inches. Everything turned to chaos. The leader started yelling for the first aid supplies, while Chris struggled to breathe. There wasn't much he could do except pack the wound and keep Chris calm. 2 boys were sent running to the ranger station about a half-mile away, and the rest of us stood there in shock. Kevin was the only one moving around, repeating, "I'm sorry," until the leader told him to be quiet. The ambulance arrived about 20 minutes later, though it felt like an eternity. That was the end of the trip. We quickly packed up, and the leader drove us home. On the ride back, Kevin seemed to fully realize the gravity of what had happened, and his cries are something I'll never forget. In my opinion, it was just a tragic accident, though some others saw it differently. One kid later claimed Chris had called Kevin a name no one our age wanted to be called, and Kevin had shot him because of it. Only Kevin knows the truth, and he's never spoken about it. I didn't hear about Chris's condition until the next morning. He'd been rushed into surgery, which went well. The arrow had punctured his left lung, missing his heart by just an inch. He made a full recovery, much to Kevin's relief. It was ruled an accident, and no charges were filed. A few months later, Kevin met with Chris to formally apologize, and from what I've heard, Chris accepted without holding a grudge. As for me, my days in Scouts ended the moment my mom found out about the incident. I didn't mind too much, though, since I ended up getting into BMX, which turned out to be a lot safer overall. It's around 2010, and I'm still living with my parents. We moved into the neighborhood when I was 11. Not long after, I discovered the woods across the road. They quickly became my refuge, a necessity due to the bullying I faced and the tension at home. The neighborhood didn't have many kids, and the few who were around were older and mostly uninterested. The hostility I endured left me a very anxious child, so I spent most of my free time alone. One day, curiosity got the better of me, and I wandered into the woods. It was completely empty, and for the first time in years, I felt safe. I stumbled upon a small clearing surrounded by oak trees and claimed it as my secret hideout. Over time, I began spending more and more hours there, eventually even falling asleep one night. When I returned home the next day, I expected my parents to be furious, but they hadn't even noticed I was gone. That gave me all the excuse I needed, and I started camping out in my hideout occasionally. First, no one missed me. I realized I'd need camping gear to make my stays more comfortable. I tried sneaking things from home, but they didn't last long. Asking my parents for money was not an option. So I began knocking on doors, offering to mow lawns. I had no idea how to mow a lawn, but that didn't matter. The real issue was finding a lawnmower. I secretly borrowed my dad's mower for jobs until he caught me and gave me a harsh punishment. Luckily, by then, I'd earned enough to buy a worn-down mower of my own. It wasn't great, but it got the job done. Once I saved up some money again, I rode my rickety bike 7 miles to a tiny surplus store. I bought a backpack filled with what I thought were essential camping supplies. Excited to try it out, I skipped a week of school to camp in my hideout. This wasn't just a hobby, it became my only source of happiness and a sense of security. For the next several years, I only went to school enough to avoid trouble and spent all my free time in the woods. By now, I saw those woods as my territory. Anyone entering was an intruder in my eyes, and when that day came, I reacted without hesitation. One Sunday afternoon, I was camping as usual and headed down a well-trodden path to a nearby creek for water. Across the creek, about 60 yards away, was a quiet road. I rarely saw anyone there, but this time, I noticed a parked RV. 2 men were coming and going, oblivious to my presence. Hours later, when I returned, they were still there, this time drinking and recklessly firing guns. I was annoyed but became furious when a stray bullet struck the water a few feet from me. I sprinted home and called the local authorities. Pretending to be a passerby, I told them I'd been lost and stumbled upon the men, who threatened me with their guns. Looking back, I know how wrong that was, but at the time I was angry and scared. A few days later, I overheard a news report about a major drug bust. Acting on an anonymous tip, deputies found 2 men shooting guns near a secluded road. Their RV turned out to be a mobile drug lab. Both men were arrested and held without bail. I realized it was my tip that led to their capture. The weight of what I'd done hit me, but I was sure no one could link the call to me. Months later, however, I received an anonymous note in the mail. "You messed with the wrong people, kid." Fear gripped me, but I dismissed it as a coincidence. Then another letter came a week later, this time more explicit. "You better pray we get time served." I couldn't figure out how they'd identified me, but it no longer mattered. The letters kept coming. When the sentencing day arrived, the men were each given 15 years for manufacturing drugs while possessing firearms. I was sure my time was up. I stopped going to school and spent all my days in the woods. I knew it wouldn't save me, but if I was going to die, I wanted to be somewhere I loved. Months passed, then years with no sign of them. I slowly began to believe it had all been a scare tactic. My life moved on. Over the last decade, I barely thought about them. Then, last week, a new anonymous letter appeared in my mailbox. Asterisk, you'd better make a will. Time's running out. Asterisk, I dropped it instantly, my stomach in knots. My girlfriend was with me and read the letter too. She looked concerned, but I brushed it off as a cruel prank and refused to explain. Now, the ghosts of my past have returned, bringing fear back into my life. I'm constantly looking over my shoulder, terrified they'll harm my girlfriend or our newborn baby. Going to the authorities briefly crossed my mind, but without proof of who's sending these notes, I doubt they can do much. My options feel limited. Without anyone to confide in, I'm sharing this here anonymously. Maybe it's the safety of the internet, or maybe I just need to be heard. All I can say is this: be cautious about the decisions you make when you're young. Please keep my family in your thoughts. I'll need all the luck I can get. In early summer 2018, I set off on a long-awaited camping adventure in the western region of the country. The trip had been nearly 2 years in the making, and it marked my first time camping while equipped with firearms. The drive to my destination was delightful, and I gained new appreciation for that part of the country. Upon arrival, I parked my car and contacted a friend to confirm I had reached safely. After reviewing my plans one final time, I embarked on the hike to my chosen campsite. The first day passed peacefully. The weather was so pleasant that I decided to sleep beneath the stars beside my fire. The sense of freedom was exhilarating, a stark contrast to the restrictions I was accustomed to back home. The following day unfolded much the same. I strolled leisurely and admired the wildlife. Shortly after midday, I finally arrived at the spot I had scouted for camping. A quick survey of the area confirmed my decision was sound. I set up camp swiftly and began preparing lunch. After eating, I felt drowsy but chose instead to practice shooting, one of the main reasons for my trip. A dry creek bed about 200 yards from camp seemed like the safest spot to shoot. I placed some steel targets and started firing. The exhilaration was indescribable. I imagined this was how pioneers might have felt. I had gone through a box of ammunition and was reloading my rifle when distant gunfire echoed through the hills. The sound intrigued me and I decided to investigate. The shots sounded like they came from multiple firearms, making me uneasy. Sensing potential danger, I returned to my campsite, a decision I continue to both regret and be thankful for. Back at camp, I contemplated dinner. The gunfire ceased shortly after I returned, and I assumed the shooters had moved on. After spending about an hour cleaning my firearms, I settled by the fire, too tired to prepare a big meal. I snacked on crackers and a cheese spread, then decided to turn in early as the sun dipped behind the trees. It was pitch black when a noise startled me awake. I sat up and looked out of my tent, but saw nothing. Assuming it was a dream, I lay back down. Just as I started to drift off again, a chilling scream shattered the silence. It was one of the most horrifying sounds I had ever heard, second only to a rabbit's cry when caught by a predator. The screams continued, joined by a woman's desperate pleas for help. Fear gripped me. I thought about grabbing my rifle and heading toward the sounds, but common sense prevailed. Charging into the dark, toward an unknown threat, felt foolish. One final scream pierced the night, followed by a single gunshot. Paralyzed with terror, I stayed in my tent until dawn, dreading what might come next. As the first light broke, I hastily packed my gear and left the area, driven by a growing sense of dread. What had taken me a day and a half to hike earlier now took less than a day to retrace. Constantly looking over my shoulder, rifle in hand, I finally reached my car after dark and began the drive home, relieved to leave that place behind. But relief soon gave way to guilt. I replayed the events in my mind, berating myself for not acting. I had likely heard a woman in distress, possibly being murdered, and I had done nothing. The drive home was a torment, a battle between shame and logic. I alternated between self-loathing for my inaction and convincing myself that rushing into such a situation would have been reckless. Eventually, I learned the truth. Months later, I found out that I had camped less than a mile from the hideout of an outlaw biker gang. That day, the gang had been using the area for target practice with illegal firearms. Tragically, they had also abducted a young female hiker. After subjecting her to hours of abuse, they let her go, only to shoot her as she fled. Miraculously, she survived and managed to reach the highway, where she found help. After a week in the hospital, she was released, and the gang members were arrested. Most accepted plea deals that would see them imprisoned for life. Though relieved the victim survived, the what-ifs still haunt me. I never told anyone about that night, using an anonymous account to share my story. I know some will judge me a coward, and I don't blame them. I share this story for those who believe it's best to avoid involvement in others' problems. I understand that mindset now, but I also know the weight of the guilt I carry. Helping others may come with risks, but the regret of doing nothing is far worse. We share this world, and when we can, we should help one another. If you ever find yourself in a position to assist someone in need, remember, you could be the difference between their survival and their end. When I was a kid, life was far from steady. After splitting from my dad, my mom had a series of bad relationships, even letting some of her boyfriends move in. When I was around 13, she married a guy named Mike, someone she met at the bar where she worked. Mike was a complete jerk who tried unsuccessfully to act like my dad. Mom had worked hard to keep my dad and me apart, but I always knew he cared about me and wanted to be in my life. Before the divorce, my dad and I would spend time hunting, fishing, and camping. Those experiences gave me a deep love for the outdoors, a love that eventually made my decision to live in the woods feel natural. By the time I turned 16, I couldn't handle Mike's controlling behavior anymore. Despite being unemployed most of the time, Mike expected me to wake up at 8 a.m. daily. Unlike him, I worked 5 days a week and had been saving up to move out since my sophomore year. Getting away from him and my mom was a top priority. I even dropped out of school after the first semester and earned my GED. My dad wasn't thrilled about it, but he understood and signed the paperwork for me. On my rare days off, I liked to sleep in, feeling I deserved it. But Mike would barge in, yelling at me to wake up. One day, fed up and stressed from work, I told him to leave me alone. He looked like he was about to hit me, so I reacted by knocking him to the ground. That was the breaking point. I knew he'd call the cops, so I grabbed my backpack and left, never planning to return. Without a solid plan or transportation, I wandered aimlessly for most of the day. By evening, I found a wooded area on the outskirts of town, walked far enough in to stay hidden, and set up a basic camp. I built a fire and made a bed out of clothes and leaves. Surprisingly, I slept well that night, though I hadn't intended to stay in the woods long term. I figured I'd quickly find an abandoned place to stay until I saved enough money, but it wasn't that simple. Any decent spot was either secured or dangerous, like the one place overrun by a gang. That night, I realized life with Mike might have been better than some of the alternatives. As another weekend ended, I returned to my forest camp, determined to make it work. Sleeping on the ground wasn't sustainable, so I went to a store and bought a sleeping bag and a tarp. Using foil to line my makeshift shelter helped retain heat from the fire, making the cooler nights bearable. I kept myself clean in public bathrooms and did laundry at a 24-hour laundromat. Sometimes I even slept there on laundry days. Eventually, I found a stream near my camp where I could bathe. Despite my situation, I kept my job, which helped me stay afloat. The woods weren't without their challenges. A railroad track ran through the area, bringing hobos who camped about half a mile from me. I first stumbled upon their camp by accident, using the tracks as a quiet way to avoid police. One evening, I noticed a fire in the distance and cautiously approached. I found 3 older men sitting around it. After watching for a while, I decided they weren't a threat and joined them. Over time, I became part of their group, spending evenings listening to their stories and sharing my own. One night, a man named Jack joined the group. He seemed harmless but grew aggressive as he drank. Something I said set him off and he attacked me. The others intervened, giving me time to escape. From then on, I avoided strangers at the camp. This rule worked until I let my guard down with a newcomer. A few months later, I met a guy my age named Kyle. He seemed friendly, and we spent a couple of evenings talking around the fire. On the second night, he asked to borrow money. When I said no, he pulled a knife and demanded cash. I was terrified but lied, claiming I had none. When he didn't believe me, he slashed my arm as I tried to run. Just as things looked bleak, one of the regulars, Pete, appeared and knocked Kyle out with a wooden club. Pete had overheard Kyle's plans to rob me and stepped in to help. After that, Kyle left and I never saw him again. The incident pushed me to move forward with finding a place to live. I spent a weekend searching online and eventually found a tiny apartment. It wasn't much, but it was mine. A few months later, I upgraded to a better place and stayed there for 3 years. I often think about the people I met during that time. Many of them were kind and supportive despite their struggles. However, living rough isn't something I'd recommend to anyone. This is an experience my partner and I had earlier this year, right after restrictions were lifted in our region. We packed our bags and headed out for a hike at a nearby national forest, something we had done regularly since we first started dating. Speaking for myself, I was thrilled to be back on the trails. The plan was simple: hike to a pond, camp overnight, and return to the car the next day. The weather was perfect: clear skies, warm air, and dry paths. That morning, it seemed like we were the only ones on the trail. Around lunchtime, we stopped at a clearing halfway to the pond. At the campsite, there was another pair sitting at a wooden picnic bench. We asked if we could join, and they agreed. It didn't take long for us to strike up a conversation. They were newlyweds celebrating their honeymoon, which my partner, who's a hopeless romantic, absolutely loved hearing. She started sharing our own story of how we met, along with some other sentimental details that I don't recall much. After a couple of hours, we said our goodbyes and continued our trek. We reached the pond just before nightfall, tired but content. While I worked on setting up the tent, my partner prepared a quick meal, and we spent the evening around a campfire making marshmallow treats. By 10 p.m., we decided to call it a night. I woke up at dawn to get the fire going for breakfast. As we ate, we packed up the campsite carefully, ensuring the fire was completely out before hitting the trail again. By mid-morning, we reached the halfway point but decided not to stop this time. About 2 hours later, we crossed paths with the husband from the couple we had met the day before. Oddly, his wife wasn't with him. My partner asked about her, and he explained that she had felt sick during the night and decided to head back home. While he said this, he seemed anxious and avoided making eye contact. Before we could ask any follow-up questions, he mentioned that his wife had insisted he finish the trip alone. Felt a little off, but we had no reason to doubt his story. A group of hikers approached just then, and he excused himself to chat with them. I didn't feel it was my place to pry into their personal matters. My partner looked like she wanted to stay, but I reminded her we had commitments that evening. Reluctantly, she agreed, and we continued on our way. When we reached the parking area later, we noticed a few small groups talking among themselves. As we loaded our gear into the car, more vehicles, including a ranger's truck, pulled into the lot. Again, I didn't think much of it at the time. That afternoon, back home, we went about our usual routine. It wasn't until breakfast the next day that everything took a turn. While having coffee, I turned on the TV and caught a news report about a deceased hiker. When they showed her photo, I nearly choked. It was the woman we had met just 2 days prior. I called my partner over to confirm what I was seeing. Without hesitation, she gasped, recognizing the woman. Moments later, the screen displayed a wedding photo of the couple, leaving no doubt it was them. The news said the woman had fallen from a cliffside, a popular overlook we had visited in the past. According to her husband, they had been watching the sunrise when she lost her footing and fell hundreds of feet. While the story seemed plausible, something about it didn't sit right with me. Why hadn't he mentioned this to us when we saw him? Why tell us she was ill? The timing felt strange, and his demeanor seemed off. If it had been me, I wouldn't have been able to hold it together after such an event. We'd passed several other hikers that morning, but none of them mentioned anything unusual. My partner and I talked it over and agreed that something seemed fishy. Eventually, we decided to contact the authorities. I called the local sheriff's department and shared what we knew. The deputy put me on hold briefly, then came back and said someone might reach out to us if necessary. That was nearly a year ago, and we haven't heard from anyone since. This brings me to writing this. What do you think? Both my partner and I feel strongly that something isn't right here, but we have no concrete evidence, just a gut feeling. If law enforcement thought we had anything valuable to contribute, surely they would have reached out by now, right? I don't want to make trouble for someone who might genuinely be grieving, but I also can't shake the feeling that someone might be getting away with something terrible. Should I keep pressing, or let the police handle it? The story is set during the summer of 2007. I had spent several years hiking trails in a nearby national forest. The hour-long drive to the forest went smoothly, as usual. I parked close to the visitor center and informed the ranger of my planned route. After a final check of my gear, I began the 2-mile trek to my usual campsite. At the time, I had no idea someone's life had just taken a tragic turn, and mine was about to change too. My passion for the outdoors had developed a few years earlier, following a deeply personal loss after a major tragedy. While I wasn't directly involved, I had lost someone incredibly dear to me. She and I had been close during our college days, but had drifted apart. The internet helped us reconnect, and we began making plans to meet during the holiday season. We even discussed rekindling our relationship. When I got the devastating news of her passing, it shattered me. I sank into despair and even considered ending my own life. I packed my gear and hiked to a secluded spot, intending never to return. But when I arrived, the natural beauty of the area struck me. Despite my grief, the tranquility of the mountains gave me a reason to hold on. From that moment on, nature became my refuge. Whenever my emotions overwhelmed me, I sought solace in the wilderness. Now, back to that summer in 2007. By then, my outdoor retreats had become a routine. That first evening passed uneventfully. The following day, I decided to hike into one of the nearby gorges. These explorations often rewarded me with unique stones and artifacts for my growing collection. After a quick breakfast of instant oatmeal, I set out along the trail. While descending a steep cliffside, a sudden glimmer of light caught my attention. At first, I couldn't pinpoint its source. Moments later, another flash briefly blinded me. I squinted and spotted a pair of arms waving frantically about 50 feet below. I hurried down the trail, stopping at a rocky ledge to get a better view. As I stepped onto it, I felt the ground shift under my weight. Before I could react, the ledge gave way and I fell. The descent seemed to last forever. Bracing for impact, I clenched my teeth. To my relief, I landed relatively unharmed, having only fallen about 15 feet. Lying on my back, I took a moment to collect myself. Remembering why I had rushed there, I tried to stand, only to realize my left foot was wedged tightly between two boulders. After several attempts, I managed to free it by pushing one rock aside and pulling my leg out. Looking around, I saw the figure I had noticed earlier, a woman lying motionless to my right. Carefully making my way down, I approached her. At first, she appeared lifeless, but then her lips moved slightly. I knelt beside her, speaking softly to calm her. Her eyes fluttered open, and a faint smile crossed her face. "I thought no one would find me," she whispered in a hoarse but kind voice. "Do you have any water?" I quickly grabbed my canteen, which was a bit battered but still functional. Tilting it gently, I let her sip a small amount to avoid overwhelming her stomach. Over the next few minutes, she told me how she had ended up in her precarious position. Her injuries were severe, and I knew time was critical. I promised to get help and wrapped her in a fleece jacket from my pack. The climb back up the unstable cliff was grueling. My back ached, and my knees protested every step. After what felt like hours, I made it back to the ranger station at around 1 p.m. The ranger wasted no time assembling a rescue team. An ambulance took me to the hospital for evaluation, and I spent the night there. It wasn't until almost 7 p.m. that I saw her being wheeled into the emergency room. She was rushed into surgery immediately. Hours passed before I got any updates, but the news was positive. Despite her injuries, a punctured lung, concussion, broken arm, and more, she made a full recovery. Her name was Lauren, and she later reunited with her family. I heard she eventually moved to Montana with her husband and 2 daughters. As for me, my journey of healing continued, but that's a tale for another day. I'm just glad I was there to help Lauren in her darkest hour and wish her a life filled with happiness and love. When I was a child, I always dreamed of joining the local scout group. Back then, it was still a well-respected organization, teaching practical outdoor skills. I think I was about 11 when I finally persuaded my mom to let me sign up. She was hesitant at first. Growing up in Poland, she'd seen groups like this being little more than military prep for kids. I asked the group leader to speak with her, and after a long discussion and plenty of questions, her worries were eased. With that obstacle out of the way, I officially became a junior scout. Sadly, scouting in my town wasn't what I had imagined. Our leader was a frazzled single parent who lacked much enthusiasm, which was pretty disheartening for me. About half a year in, however, I got some exciting news. A scout leader from another district invited our troop on a camping trip. Camping was one of the main reasons I wanted to join in the first place. My family used to go all the time, but since my parents separated, those trips had come to a halt. Early one Saturday, the visiting scout leader picked us up in his van and drove us to the campsite. Our group wasn't very big, only around 10 kids in total. After arriving, he gathered us and gave instructions on how to set up our tents. Each tent was meant for 2 kids, but because we had an odd number, I got one to myself. The leader guided us through pitching our tents, and while a few kids needed extra help, most of us managed pretty well. The morning was spent learning first aid and general safety tips. I got paired with the leader and became the patient for demonstrations, ending up wrapped in bandages and strapped onto a makeshift stretcher. It was actually a lot of fun and turned out to be quite educational. After finishing our first aid lessons, we had lunch and took a short break. By mid-afternoon, we gathered for archery practice, which I was thrilled about. I'd been obsessed with bows and arrows ever since watching my first action movie featuring a cool archer. This was my first real opportunity to try it out. The leader showed us the basics and made sure to emphasize safety. Naturally, a bunch of excited preteens paid little attention to that part. I was the first to try. I pulled the bowstring back and crouched, trying to mimic a pose I'd seen in a movie, but I was quickly told to stand properly. That part made it less cool, but when my arrow landed close to the target, I felt a rush of pride. The rest of the group followed, taking turns before we were allowed to shoot more freely. Everyone was chatting and competing to see who could hit closest to the bullseye. That's when the accident happened. One boy, Nathan, was talking to another kid, Alex, while holding his bow. Nathan had an arrow loosely drawn when Alex said something that made him turn suddenly. Somehow, Nathan lost control and the arrow flew. It struck Alex in the chest, going in about 7 inches. Chaos erupted. The leader shouted for the first aid kit, while Alex clutched at the wound, struggling to breathe. 2 of the older kids were sent running to the ranger station to get help. The rest of us stood frozen, unsure of what to do. Nathan, meanwhile, was pacing back and forth, repeating, "I'm sorry," over and over until the leader snapped at him to stop. The ambulance arrived after what felt like an eternity, probably about 20 minutes. The trip ended immediately after that. Everyone hurried to pack up, and we rode back home in silence, aside from Nathan's sobbing. His guilt was overwhelming, and even at that age, I felt bad for him. Thankfully, the next morning we heard that Alex had undergone surgery and was stable. The arrow had punctured a lung but missed his heart by an inch. He made a full recovery, which came as a relief to everyone. Nathan later apologized directly to Alex, and from what I heard, Alex forgave him. It was ruled a tragic accident, and no charges were filed. As for me, my time as a scout ended there. When my mom found out what had happened, she immediately pulled me out of the group. I wasn't too upset, though. I ended up picking up BMX riding instead, which turned out to be a much safer hobby. About a month ago, I was working in a forest with a crew cutting down trees for a new housing project. I wasn't thrilled about it, but it paid the bills. These days, I'm working with someone local, but that's unrelated to the story. Logging is tough work, and spending so much time in the woods means you sometimes stumble on odd things, like abandoned tents, piles of trash, clothes, and even the occasional shoe. A few years back, someone found human remains out there. They still haven't been identified, which is unsettling. I've been in this line of work for a few years but hadn't come across anything noteworthy. Just the typical discarded stuff. That changed one evening. It was around 6 p.m., and we were wrapping up for the day. It's dangerous to work in the dark, so we usually knock off early in winter. There were only 2 other guys with me, and while they stayed by the truck, I wandered into the woods to relieve myself. Nature calls, and out there, the forest is often the only option. Sure, we had a portable toilet, but no one really wants to use those unless necessary. While I was trying to get things moving, let's just say I'd been having some issues lately, I heard a branch snap behind me. It was getting darker, and I'd wandered further from the truck than I should have, so I started feeling uneasy. I tried to glance back without losing focus on what I was doing when I heard another snap, followed by laughter. That's when I figured it was my coworkers messing with me. "If you wanted to embarrass me, just say so," I shouted, half turning. One of them called back, "Hurry up, it's freezing." I heard them walk away toward the truck, and eventually, their voices faded. I finished up, zipped up, and started heading back when I heard another snap, this time farther away. I paused. It sounded like it came from where I had been facing. "Real funny, guys," I called, expecting them to jump out and scare me, but there was no response, no laughter. The forest was quiet. "Come on, let's go." I tried again, but nothing. Frustrated, I muttered something about leaving them behind if they didn't knock it off. Then, just as I turned around to leave, I heard it again. Snap. This time it came from right behind me. I turned and started to say something, but the words froze in my throat. Standing far off in the untouched woods was something. It was about my height, maybe 6 feet, but its head was oddly shaped, almost too big for its body. Steam rose off it, though the air was icy, around 20 degrees. It had no fur, no hair, just bare skin. which made the steam all the more alarming. But what stopped me cold were its eyes. They glowed red, almost like how an animal's eyes reflect light. But these were different, more intense. I could hear its breathing, heavy and raspy, almost like a growl. It was far enough away, maybe 50 yards, but the sound carried. My instincts kicked in, and I started backing away toward the truck, heart racing. I wasn't sure how far I had wandered, but I hoped I wasn't too far. Soon I was running. That's when I heard it. The pounding of something massive crashing through the forest behind me. Whatever it was fast. I glanced back and saw it moving on all fours, even though it had looked like it walked upright before. I shouted toward my coworkers, "Start the truck! There's something out here." They either didn't hear me or thought I was joking. I ran harder until I could see them. They were casually hanging by the truck, laughing until they saw my face. That's when they realized I wasn't kidding. I jumped in, yelling for them to get moving. They hesitated until the thing chasing me crested a hill. Its wheezing growl filled the air, and they scrambled into the truck just as it slammed into the side, denting the door. We sped off, the creature screaming behind us before disappearing into the woods. Back on the road, we were all shaken. My friends apologized for not believing me, but I wasn't focused on that. I was terrified about going back. The next day, we told our boss. He didn't believe us at first, but the dent in the truck was hard to ignore. Regardless, we had to go back. No work meant no pay, and we couldn't afford to skip. That day was quiet. Everyone stuck to themselves, uneasy. Only a few of us were there, tasked with cleaning up the site. By the afternoon, as we were loading equipment, the growling returned from the south. We froze, scanning the woods. At first, we couldn't see anything, which was even scarier. Then one of my coworkers pointed it out. The creature was back, closer this time. We bolted for the truck. One of the guys grabbed a pistol from the glove box and fired off a few shots. Two seemed to hit, one in the leg, one in the chest. Staggered but didn't fall. We didn't wait to see what happened next. We sped off again. The following morning, I called a local wildlife organization to report what we saw. I don't know if they took me seriously, even when I mentioned the gunshots. I just hoped they didn't go looking for it. The weeks that followed were quiet. We never saw the creature again. Maybe it left the area, or maybe those shots were enough to kill it. Whatever it was, I'm just glad I haven't had to face it again. I still don't know what it was. So, I'm sure most people have heard about those mysterious staircases in forests, right? If not, you should check out that story by the park ranger. It's pretty detailed. Personally, I always thought the whole thing was nonsense. If I recall, we never got a clear answer about why climbing them is supposed to be a bad idea. I don't know if that story was partly true or entirely made up, but I can guarantee this one is real. This happened nearly 6 years ago, and the memory still feels vivid because of how bizarre it was. There's a thick forest behind my property. I'd wandered back there a few times out of curiosity, but I never went far enough to stumble across anything interesting like streams or hidden meadows. One day, early in spring, I decided to explore more thoroughly since the land technically belonged to me when I bought the house. I'd walked about a mile in when I stumbled across something that made me stop in my tracks. It was a stone staircase standing in the middle of a crumbling brick foundation, maybe 30 feet long by 15 feet wide. The base was barely a foot high, but the stairs themselves rose around 6 feet. It was odd how they stood there without any visible support. I thought it would be cool to climb to the top and get a better view of the surrounding woods. I moved cautiously since the stairs didn't look very sturdy. To my surprise, I made it to the top without any trouble. But the moment I turned around, hoping to catch a glimpse of my house in the distance, things went wrong. My foot dislodged a loose stone and I slipped. As I fell, I braced myself for the harsh impact of the ground below. But instead of hitting dirt, my hands sank into icy, powdery snow. Remember, this was early spring. There shouldn't have been any snow. And it wasn't snowing when I climbed up either. Shocked, I scrambled to my feet, freezing in my sneakers, cargo pants, and light jacket. Looking around, I saw the entire forest blanketed in thick snow, at least a foot deep. More snowflakes were falling steadily from the sky. The staircase was still standing, just as before, but now surrounded by this winter landscape. My mind was spinning. Was I dreaming? Had I hit my head and blacked out? The snow felt real, too real. My fingers were numb after just a few moments of digging through the snow to look for my phone, which was nowhere to be found. I decided to head back toward my house, hoping the walk would somehow snap me out of whatever this was. The cold bit into my toes as I trudged through the snow. After what felt like an eternity, I finally reached my yard. But something was off. My car wasn't there. Instead, two unfamiliar vehicles and a small purple bicycle were parked in the driveway. Still convinced I was dreaming, I went inside. A holiday wreath fell off the door as I entered. The inside was decorated for Christmas. My house, but not my house. From another room, I heard a television and a man's voice calling out, "Who's there?" Moments later, a tall man appeared, holding a baseball bat and looking ready to swing. I froze and tried to explain that I didn't know what was happening, but he shouted that I was crazy and threatened to call the police. When he swung the bat at me and hit the wall, sending drywall crumbling to the floor, I bolted out of there. Panicked, I ran back into the woods and retraced my steps to the staircase. Gasping for breath, I stared at it, thinking through everything that had happened. That's when a wild idea struck me. What if climbing and falling from the stairs had somehow caused all this? Maybe doing it again would reverse it. With no better plan, I climbed back up, turned toward where my house should be, and let myself fall. This time I hit the hard, unforgiving ground. But when I looked around, the snow was gone, and the warm spring sun was shining again. I made my way back to the house, where my car was parked, and everything seemed normal. No man with a bat, no strange cars. Took me a long time to process what had happened. After thinking it over, I've come to a conclusion that sounds unbelievable. When I fell the first time, I think I landed in the past. The man I ran into was the previous owner of the house. I remembered him because he told me he sold the place after his daughter left for college, wanting to downsize. He'd also mentioned a disturbing event that happened years ago but wouldn't share details. Looking back, I can't help but wonder if I was the disturbing event he was talking about. He said I looked familiar, and we agreed I resembled my dad, whom he once went to school with. I know how crazy this sounds, but it's the only explanation that fits. If anyone has a better theory, I'd love to hear it. In the meantime, here's a word of advice. If you ever find a staircase in the woods, don't climb it. I own a small patch of land in the forest. I head out there every so often to escape life's usual noise. While I bring my phone and laptop with me, they're mainly for browsing the internet. It's more about disconnecting from the hustle of daily life than avoiding technology altogether. I'm glad I have them now, as I can share this story where others might read it. Over the past few days, I've been hearing strange noises under my cabin. Something crawling around down there. I'm not sure what animals live in these woods, but this thing moves quickly. Sometimes I hear scratching or even low growls. It's been keeping me awake at night, so I decided to call someone to investigate. I'd found the area where it seemed to be entering, but I didn't have the skills to deal with this sort of thing myself. The person I called came out earlier today, and now I feel like I have even more questions. The hole leading under the cabin wasn't much more than a foot wide, so he had to crawl through it. He snapped some pictures of the area while he was under there and thought he might have seen something briefly, but then dismissed it as his imagination. When he came out, we reviewed the photos together, and I didn't know how to react. Deep claw marks were everywhere, etched into the ground, the wooden beams, and even the concrete pillars holding up the cabin. I pressed him about what could have done this, but he kept insisting it was a bear. I've seen bears before, and there's no way one could have fit under there. This guy barely fit himself, and he wasn't much over 120 pounds. The last photo he showed me was of a small depression in the dirt, maybe 6 inches deep and a foot across. I tried to get more answers, but he reassured me it wasn't anything serious and promised to return the next day to take care of it. I wanted to believe him, but I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling. That night, I decided to call the local wildlife office instead. It was late, so I left a message explaining what had been happening and hoped they'd get back to me soon. The next 2 days were rough, no return call and barely any sleep. Whatever was under the cabin seemed angrier after the inspection. The growling and scratching got worse, lasting hours before it finally stopped. I managed to doze off around 2 a.m. By the time I woke up later that morning, I still hadn't heard back from the wildlife office. I tried calling them again, but spent nearly an hour on hold before giving up. I stayed indoors all day, too nervous to venture out with that thing still lurking. After all, if it could scratch through concrete, I didn't want to imagine what it might do to me. The pest control guy never returned, nor did he answer my calls. That night, I was on my own. I didn't even bother trying to sleep at first. Instead, I scrolled through online forums to distract myself. Sure enough, the noises started again. This time, though, they seemed calmer, less frantic. It felt like the creature was settling back in after the disturbance. I'd hear it shuffle around for a while, leave, and then come back. The fourth time it returned, I heard a loud thud, which caught my attention. After that, there was silence, no more scratching, growling, or movement. I thought it might have finally gone to sleep, so I let myself drift off too. The next morning, I was jolted awake by an overwhelming stench. It was so bad that stepping outside made it even worse. I nearly vomited right there on the porch. That's when the wildlife office finally called back, saying they were on their way. I told them about the smell, and they assured me they'd bring the necessary equipment. When they arrived, they donned protective gear, coveralls, gloves, and gas masks. One worker crawled under the cabin while the other stayed outside to assist. After about 20 minutes, they managed to drag out what was causing the smell. I couldn't identify the creature. It looked like a large dog, but most of its fur was gone. If it was a dog, it was severely diseased. They explained that it must have hit its head on a beam while running around, breaking its neck. The body had turned a bluish-gray overnight, and the stench was so unbearable that even the workers gagged through their masks. As they continued clearing the area, they found 6 small, let's call them pups, in a hollowed-out section of dirt. Sadly, all of them were dead, likely stillborn. The workers said they'd arrange for a cleanup crew and advised me to leave for a while. I didn't argue. I packed up and left. It's been a few days, and I haven't heard any updates. Part of me wonders if I stumbled upon something I wasn't supposed to. I'm too scared to go back and find out. About a week ago, I found myself completely alone, and this happened in Georgia. A friend of mine mentioned a fishing spot he'd stumbled upon a few days earlier, and I decided to check it out. He had caught a decent amount there, so I figured I'd give it a shot. I asked him to tag along, but his son wasn't feeling well, so he stayed home to care for him. I told him no problem and headed out on my own, relying on the directions he had described to me. After a bit of navigating, I reached the place. It was tucked away pretty deep in the forest, but I've always had a decent sense of direction, so I wasn't worried about getting turned around. When I got there, I realized this wasn't just a regular fishing spot. It was the size of a small pond, almost like a mini lake. I found a fallen tree to sit on, rolled it closer for convenience, and set up my fishing rod. The day was beautiful. Not that it matters for the story, but it stuck with me because of what happened next. After settling down, I cast my line and lit up a cigarette, half hoping to catch something and half just enjoying the solitude. It was peaceful and I felt like I could finally unwind. About 15 or 20 minutes later, I'd already caught a couple of small fish, but it wasn't a stellar outing. One even managed to leap out of the bucket since I forgot to secure the lid. I figured I'd give it one last go, so I used my last bit of bait, thinking that if I didn't get anything else, I'd let the others go. While waiting on my final cast, I suddenly heard a strange noise from across the water. It reminded me of a dog lapping up water after a long run, loud and slurping. I focused on the opposite shore and could barely make out something drinking there. My eyesight isn't great these days, but I could tell it wasn't anything I recognized, and that unsettled me. It was about the size of a large dog, maybe a deer, crouched low with its head dipping into the water. But then it did something no deer would ever do. It jumped straight into the water. I'm no wildlife expert, so I thought maybe it was some animal I didn't know about. Weird, but not impossible. A moment later, my fishing line jerked. I reached for the pole wedged into the tree trunk, but before I could react, the entire thing was pulled under. It happened so quickly that I had no chance of grabbing it. Shocked, I stared at the rippling water. I couldn't imagine what was strong enough to do that, and my thoughts went back to the creature I had just seen. Feeling uneasy, I grabbed my pocket knife, a small one, but sharp enough to defend myself, and started gathering my things. That's when I heard a sloshing sound behind me. My heart dropped. Summoning my courage, I turned around and nearly stumbled. The thing I'd seen across the water was now right in front of me. It was covered in slimy, scaly skin and had large webbed feet. Despite walking on all fours, it moved unnervingly fast. Its face was long and duck-like, with tiny, shiny black eyes. Around its neck were large gills that pulsed as it breathed. I could see rows of sharp, tiny teeth inside its mouth, and its hissing exhale made me sick to my stomach. The creature started advancing toward me. I held the knife out, hoping to keep it at bay, but it suddenly lunged. In sheer panic, I swung the blade and somehow managed to slash it across the gills. It let out a horrible screech and retreated back into the water. I didn't wait to see what it would do next. I left my gear behind and ran as fast as I could back to my truck. Once I got home, I called my friend and told him what happened. He didn't believe me at first, and honestly, I could hardly believe it myself. But the next day, we went back to the spot together, and the tracks that creature left were still visible in the mud. Since then, I haven't returned to that place. I don't know what kind of thing lives in the waters of Georgia, but I know I wasn't supposed to see it. I've avoided that area ever since, and I doubt I'll ever go back. I loved exploring when I was younger. When my family moved to a new house, I noticed a wooded area behind it, and I was thrilled. I must have been around 9 or 10 years old when this happened. We'd been living there for a few weeks, and I kept asking my parents to let me explore the woods, but they refused. They told me the fence in the backyard was put up specifically to keep kids like me out. My dad made it clear the fence wasn't to be crossed. That didn't stop me. On our first day there, I checked the fence and found one post that seemed loose. I figured if I pulled it hard enough, I could wiggle through. One afternoon, when my dad was at work and my mom was busy on the phone, I slipped outside, loosened the fence post, and squeezed into the woods. It was amazing. The tall trees were like something out of a storybook. I remember standing there, completely mesmerized, but I didn't waste too much time gawking. I wanted to see what I could find. Eventually, I discovered a well-trodden path. Maybe someone who had lived there before used it. The path was relatively clear, No big roots or thorn bushes to slow me down, so I ran along it, following where it led. Soon I reached a small creek. It wasn't very wide, maybe about 3 feet across, but I realized I'd gone farther than I probably should have. Still, curiosity got the better of me. That's when I saw it. On the other side of the creek was a wolf. At least I thought it was a wolf at first. It looked hurt, with a deep wound on its side. The more it drank from the creek, the more it whimpered in pain. I wanted to help, but the water between us made it impossible. Then, something happened that still haunts me. The wolf started to change. Its form shifted, and in front of my eyes, it turned into a man. A fully grown, unclothed man. The whimpers became cries of agony. He looked right at me and begged for help. I froze. I didn't know what to do, so I ran. I sprinted all the way back to the house and managed to get inside without my mom noticing I'd been in the woods. When she asked why I was out of breath, I said I'd been running around the yard. She just laughed, but I was shaking inside. To this day, I haven't told my parents what I saw. This is the first time I've ever spoken about it. Could it have been a shapeshifter? A skinwalker? A werewolf? I still don't know. This happened to my cousin and me when we were pretty young. I think I was 11 and he was around 9. My uncle had built us a really cool hideout in a small patch of forest near the house. It wasn't very far in, but to us it felt like a completely different world. After what happened, though, he tore it down and we weren't allowed back into the woods again. It was getting late when this all happened. The sun was low, but it wasn't dark yet, though it would have been in about an hour. I told my cousin it was time to head back, so I started gathering the snacks we'd brought while he went to relieve himself. Being 11, I was getting impatient and kept yelling at him to hurry up. Of course, he was being stubborn and ignoring me. That was until I pointed out the strange thing up in the trees. At first, he didn't believe me and told me to quit trying to scare him. But then he looked up and froze. He saw it too. He quickly zipped up and started moving back toward me. The creature perched on a branch above him was massive. It had long, sharp talons on scaly, yellow feet. Its piercing red eyes stared down at him, and its hooked beak opened to let out an ear-piercing screech. My cousin slowly backed away, and I could see his face pale with fear. As soon as he moved, the thing stretched out its enormous wings and dove toward us. The rush of air from its wings made me stagger. I tried to reach my cousin, but it was too quick. It struck him hard, knocking him to the ground, and he curled up, struggling to breathe. Without thinking, I grabbed him and bolted toward the house, praying the creature wouldn't chase us. I didn't stop running until we were in the kitchen, where my aunt was. All I could manage to say was, "He fell out of a tree." My brain must have come up with that lie, knowing no one would believe the truth. My cousin was rushed to the hospital, where they treated him for mild internal bleeding and nasty bruises on his chest. Thankfully, he recovered. In the following week, my uncle tore down the hideout and told us the woods were off limits. A month later, he put up a fence around the backyard to keep us from going anywhere near the forest. He didn't have to tell us twice. We had no desire to return. A few days after the incident, we heard the same screeching sound echoing from the woods, just like the noise it made before attacking my cousin. That was all the convincing we needed to stay far, far away. The story unfolds about 5 years ago, give or take. My buddy and I were taking a casual stroll through the forest near his home. We had been wandering for roughly 20 minutes when we stumbled upon 2 other guys. They appeared to be around our age, and we figured they were just out for a walk like us. Being friendly types, we stopped to chat for a bit. At first, the guys seemed a bit uneasy, but eventually opened up, telling us about a hangout spot. Their description was vague, but we were bored and figured, why not? Soon, we were tagging along as they led us further into the woods. We made small talk along the way, and they asked if we smoked. We said we did, and they mentioned having a spot near an old cabin where we could hang out. I was actually feeling optimistic, thinking we might discover a cool new place and maybe make some new friends. Little did I know how wrong I was. After a few more minutes of walking, we reached a rundown cabin. It looked ready to collapse at the slightest touch. One of the guys gestured toward it, saying, "Come on inside. We've got some cool stuff to show you." I was about to follow them in when my friend suddenly grabbed my arm. Confused, I turned to him, and he silently pointed toward a large boulder behind the cabin. I looked over and saw a foot quickly disappear behind it. Something felt very off. My friend muttered, "Hey, we should go. I just realized we're running late." As we started backing away, an older man emerged from behind the boulder, shouting at us. Without hesitation, we turned and sprinted back the way we had come. I don't know if the man chased us, but we didn't stop running until we were safely back at my friend's house. Once there, we told his parents what had happened. They decided to call the police, who arrived shortly after. The officers accompanied us back to the spot where we had seen the group. By the time we got there, the people were gone. The police inspected the cabin and the surrounding area, and although they didn't find much, what they did find was unsettling. A hammer, a small bag of pills, and a bunch of used syringes. I don't know what those people were up to, but whatever it was, I'm just thankful we didn't stick around to find out.